and my topic today is gender diversity in the boardroom and firms' effectiveness, a comparative analysis of Nigerian and Canadian corporate governance framework. So I shall be guided by this outline. So for the purposes of those who really are not quite advanced in this topic, I'm going to give like a brief introduction. So corporate governance relates to the way and manner in which a company is governed. And it was defined by the OECD as that framework that defines the business relationship that exists between company's shareholders, the management teams, the board of directors, and other key stakeholders. So a strong, effective, and efficient corporate governance helps to cultivate the culture of the company, leading to positive performance. So a major important element of the OECD definition I earlier gave is the role of the board as an organ that makes strategic decisions for the company. So the company and structure of a board plays a very important role in the overall performance or the overall success of the company in achieving its objectives. So over the years, emphasis have been placed on board diversity. So board diversity has been extended to include age, gender, professional experience, educational qualifications, and so on. But the most important of this is gender diversity. And this topic is a central issue because globally, companies are encouraged to appoint women to the board, and the inclusion of women has been considered to be an essential part of corporate governance. So study has shown that the presence of, of women bring about a thorough and effective board through proper vetting of ideas, of policies, of strategies, which also include sound decision-making when dealing with a diverse range of issues. And it has also been said that women have this unique characteristic of making strategic decisions that positively influence the progress and growth of the company. So when I'm talking about women in this regard, I'm not talking about appointing unqualified women to the board. I'm talking about selecting well-qualified women, but by granting priority to female candidates that have equal or better qualifications than the male candidate. So moving on, the reason why I concentrated on this research, gender diversity in the boardroom, is because of its inadequacy of the corporate governance legal framework in Nigeria. So in Nigeria, we have several prominent legislations and subsidiary legislations. We have the Companies and Allied Matters Act, the Investment Securities Act, the Banks and Other Financial Act, the Central Bank of Nigeria Act, Insurance Act, Federal Reporting Council of Nigeria Act. Those are just the primary legislation that governs corporate governance. Then looking at other subsidiary legislation, we have more than 5 of them. But all of these voluminous acts and codes, even the sector-targeted codes, did not say anything about gender diversity in the boardroom. The only one that kind of made reference to it was the Financial Reporting Act of Nigeria, which just stated that the board of directors should take into consideration gender when appointing people to the board. So it did not mention, that was the only place where they made mention of board gender diversity. So also looking at the cultural and patriarchal nature of the country, Nigeria is highly traditional, and they do not really regard appointing women to various positions in the country. For example, I remember when I applied for a position, I passed the interview, and at the interview stage, they asked me, the reason why I did not even get in is because they said, oh, she looks like she's going to get married soon and then start popping babies. Like that was a statement they made to me. So I was actually denied that position because they naturally thought that, okay, I'm in my prime years, so I'm going to get married and start having children. And once I start having children, I'll start giving excuses as to why I cannot perform my duties. So that was the reason why I was denied the job. So Nigeria is a traditional society that kind of places men at the center. So men are the ones who carry on most of those roles and activities of a company. So also looking at the limited nature of research on this subject, the fact that over the years, we have not really, this topic has not really gained prominence or is not widely or most commonly recognized, probably because they believe we are not supposed to be mentioning it, I don't know, but their limited nature of research on this subject. So this work is based on the resource dependency theory by Pfeffer and Salansik. And what this means is that the resource dependency theory, it focuses on the role of the board of directors in providing access to resources needed by the firm. So it states that directors play an important role in providing access to resources needed by this firm. So recent study on board gender diversity grounded in this theory focuses on gender and the impact of gender on the economic outcomes of a company. So from this perspective, it can be predicted that a well-diversified board improves board effectiveness and performance generally. So I tried bringing out several authors that have provided like a linkage between gender diversity and firms' effectiveness. As you know that whatever has like an advantage also have a disadvantage. I just stated only the positive aspect of it. So it was said that it improves better decision making. Having women on the board increases business outcomes, provides strategy and risk oversight. One even said having more women on the board allows companies to look into CSR. They pay more attention to that. It's not that they don't do it, they just pay more attention to that. Women are more diligent in attending meetings and joining committees. So I tried to like provide an analysis, a comparative analysis between Canada and that of Nigeria. So looking at it, Canada has a major legislative instrument on board gender diversity, which is the CBCA. And like I said earlier, Nigeria has, we have so many of them. We have about 6 primary legislation and about 5 subsidiary legislation. They are all scattered actually. So we don't have that major legislative instrument that borders on board gender diversity. And also recently, Canada brought about the corporate governance practices for all publicly listed corporations under the CBCA. So they are mandated to disclose the policies on gender diversity. So we don't even have that in Nigeria. Like I said earlier, our own FRC acts just merely stated that the board of directors should take cognizance of gender when appointing women to the board. So I also discovered that the major reason for underrepresentation of women in the boardroom was described as a pull problem by Ronald Buck. But looking at it, going through other research, I discovered that in 2018, the Canadian Board Diversity Council released an annual list of 50 qualified and diverse candidates. And out of 50, about 42 of them were women. So this particular problem does not hold true in Canada. Then looking at that of Nigeria, Nigeria own is more, ours is more serious because it stems from the beliefs, the cultural or social beliefs of the country. Then Canada ranked 19 on the Global Gender Gap Index in 2020. And as you can see, I highlighted that of Nigeria, which is 128. So Canada is like, gender diversity is still a prominent issue too, but there are several measures that have been put in place to promote gender diversity in the boardroom. And one of this is several organizations like Glass Lewis and ISS that have provided gender diversity related policies and guidance provided by corporate organization and proxy advisory firms in Canada. So these Glass Lewis and ISS are proxy advisory firms, and they both have Canadian proxy voting guidelines related to board gender diversity, and they would recommend withholding votes for the chair of the nominating committee if there are no female directors. So these are measures put in place to ensure that there's gender diversity in the boardroom. So moving on to reforms, what I think can be done in Nigeria, I later stated it at the last part, but I will come over to it. The first is reform legal and policy framework. First of all, having like a principal legislation that speaks on gender diversity in the boardroom. Women are often being discriminated against, especially when it has to do with the corporate workplace. We literally don't have a say. It is very, very difficult to see a woman as the chair, like a chairperson of the board of directors, let alone a CEO. It is very difficult to attain that position because they believe she's going to have family responsibilities. She will not be able to work overtime. She will not be able to give her best to the company in general. So reforming legal and policy framework, what I suggested was mandatory or voluntary target. But looking at Nigeria, I don't know if that would work. But like I said, it's no harm to try. But I think we just have to move into that direction first and foremost. Also creating like a conducive cultural environment, an environment where that gives the woman the permission to grow and be whoever she wants to be, and several others that I tried to highlight here. And of utmost importance is the cultural and social change. I think this is the major problem we are facing. And in order to change this issue, I think it boils down to our beliefs as a nation, like every individual in that country. Recently, there was a tweet I saw where a girl was canvassing for votes that she was running for the president of this, we have what this is called the SUG, Student Union President. And several people came out and said, why would you vote for a woman? A woman can never be the SUG president. So that's the kind of problem we are facing. So it boils down to our beliefs as a nation. And this is the most important of all. I never wanted to go into the social issues, but I realized that it's not possible to talk about the legislative framework without talking about this particular social issue, because this is what would encourage people to appoint women to the board. It's not just about changing the legislative framework. At the end of the day, if we just do that, we realize that companies would only appoint women because the law mandates them to do so, not because they see the importance of appointing women to the board. Thank you. I think I have 1 more minute left, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
You'll never get any complaints from a chair finishing early. Thanks very much. That's very interesting, comparative analysis. So, yeah, good job. To turn it over now to Rosemary Ricciardelli, who'll be talking to us about socialization into correctional work.
I was muted. I am. Thank you for having me today. So my presentation is very diverse in comparison to the prior. But what I'm going to talk about is an ethnographic experience. So for this current presentation, I've talked on this topic a little bit in a kind of a quarter of a presentation I've given before. So in this presentation, I'm expanding on my knowledge and understanding of how basically CSC socializes while training their recruits. So for this presentation, I analyzed my field notes, participation experiences, and the ethical challenges I faced during 3 stages of the Correctional Training Program. This includes a 14-week in-person component where I spent time being there. I then unpacked the socialization experience of training to become a correctional officer for Correctional Service Canada. So most correctional service related ethnographies or semi-ethnographic works study largely on prisoner experiences. Fewer scholars focus on correctional officer experiences, and often when we do ethnographic type work, it's a lot of interviews combined with participant observation. So it varies the degree to which the researcher becomes immersed in the field. In this particular study, I tried to immerse myself directly into the field, but I always remained an outsider, which I will talk about. So what I'm going to do quickly here is speak to my methodology, and then afterwards I'll talk about the situational context so people will understand, the context in which I'm gathering this data, and then I'll talk to the processes of socialization and kind of the conflicting tensions in the message that result in consequence. So methodologically, I engaged in living there and living like those who were studied. That's taken from Van Manen in 1988. I participated openly. There was no deception in all 3 stages of the Correctional Training Program. The first stage occurs online. It lasts 4 weeks. It's very intensive and there's a lot of material. The second is a series of homework assignments. Each is to be completed prior to arriving at the academy. And at the academy, you have an approximately 14-week in-person training program. So the in-person component of the training for me involved going to Ontario. I lived in a dorm alongside the other recruits. I participated in all components of the training, which included instructional hours running from 8 a.m. to 3:30 if we got out early, 4 o'clock, 4:30 some days, 5 o'clock a couple days, Monday through Friday. We also did things on weekends at times. I observed adherence to the rules of CTP participation, the regulations and directives put forth by the training academy. And these really governed everything from how I organized the dorm room, how I dressed in uniform, how I did my hair, to my comportment at the academy. I was active in my participation in CTP, meaning I actually did everything. So I engaged in fitness, I did decision-based training scenarios, I did exercises in de-escalation, I did firearms training, and I was pepper sprayed. But I always maintained the lens of a researcher. So when participating in CTP each day in uniform, I used field notes to record my daily experiences. This was observations, interactions, etc., as well as what I call training notes, which I made as I reviewed these hundreds and hundreds of pages of training content that we were frequently tested on. To complement my experiences, I have, and this will be spoken of afterwards, we've done about 400 interviews with recruits in a different project that started in 2018. So because of this longitudinal project that was underway sort of simultaneously, I had a relationship, like I was aware of the trainers, and I did know some of the recruits going in. I had already met them, particularly the people who had come back to redo the in-person component of CTP. So my ethnographic role was actually quite complex. It was marked by a lot of role ambiguity, particularly when I first entered the field, because I didn't use deception, and I think people who were seeing me there, who had met me in the context of a researcher, were really confused about what I was doing there in the context of a recruit. I was a known observer. I knew I would never truly belong, and I required that arm's length distance. It was essential to do the work at the same time. The CTP experience, it combined the nuance of an organizational ethnography, so provided insight into the organizational culture, organizational learning, and identity formation, with the greater insight of appreciative inquiry, and that's taken from Liebling. In that I approach criticalness within the context of the greater good, the objectives of the academy, and readiness to find positive ways to make change. This does not mean that I'm not critical, it just meant that I tried to pitch things in an optimistic fashion. To be fair, my approach was to learn procedures, but also the reasoning behind the procedures. What incident did they develop from? To understand the greater context legally, professionally, and practically of the material being taught, and thus the actions of all the researched. So like Sparks, I too found that the interweaving of biography, experience, and fieldwork, and the potential for criticism for my actions and non-actions proved paralyzing at times, particularly when reflecting on my experiences and when writing up the findings. It's probably the hardest research I've ever worked to write up. So the situational context, to give you insight, the National Training Academy generally has 3 active groups in CTP. The groups range to about 30 to 32 cadets. Mine was smaller, so we only had 25, and that includes me, which was kind of good because I would definitely need special attention. It was a lot in that context. My presence was noticeable to some, not to many, and anyone who did see me was likely indifferent to it. So unlike the other recruits, I had a few self-imposed restrictions on my participation that I had decided on as a researcher prior to arriving at the academy. First, I wasn't going to do 14 consecutive weeks for a variety of different reasons, both professional, process, and personal. To this end, I would take work breaks, and this is when I would take a respite from the study and dorm living. And it was in these periods of respite that also confirmed to me how immersive and consuming the CTP experience remained. Because on my re-entry to the field, I saw how dynamics changed within the group and the constant role negotiation that all recruits were enduring during CTP. I also, in a process-wise, I didn't want to just experience everything with one group. So I did 10 full weeks, and then the 4 weeks I miss, I make up with another CTP post-COVID, I guess. So that's sort of the other reason why I took those other week breaks, just to get different dynamics from different instructors. So I'll turn to the socialization process at the National Training Academy. For clarity, training I speak of as the proficiencies taught and manifest, as well as the formal messages surrounding each proficiency. Socialization instead refers to the informal messages taught at the academy, as well as the latent lessons derived from training. So training and socialization, they do not simply overlap considerably, they actually occur simultaneously, and they inform and shape each other. So socialization through training represents a central means through which COs anticipate their occupational work, prepare to perform their occupational responsibilities, and learn their position within the organization, including their degree of occupational agency, discretion, and expected commitment to their colleagues in the broader organization. And I'm not going to unpack all of these themes right now. I'm just going to focus really on the socialization component and that element of organizational socialization. So in stage 1 and stage 2 of CTP, there's vast module content. I mentioned it before. It is an exceptional amount of material where you're doing law and policy, you're reading all the commissioner's directives, you're looking at so many different components. And it requires, it's about, for me as a professor, it's about a 40-hour-a-week commitment to make it through all the material and do the testing. So it requires significant commitment to the occupation already from the get-go. So this idea that commitment for success is essential is put forth right from these beginning online components. And there's also a lot of stress to it. Like you go onto the system and the first thing is this flashing test that tells you your final test you get one shot at, you need to pass in order to proceed to the next after you finish these like 14, 15 weeks of modules. So already before you're even there, you recognize that you need to commit to the occupation. So now I'll unpack some of the elements of how I experienced socialization when I was actually at the academy, including the institutional socialization tactics inherent to the structure of the training academy. So organizations, we know, invest tremendously in recruit and staff training. Yet without an examination of socialization within a training academy, the outcomes of training, intended or not, are often ambiguous. Yet little research exists on how COs are socialized through their training or once working within the institution. So I use Van Manen's theory of organizational socialization to understand the socialization process inherent to the structure of the training academy, while noting the key elements of informal socialization recruits experience. So Van Manen defines organizational socialization as the process by which an organizational member learns the required behaviors and supportive attitudes necessary to participate as a member of an organization. So in this sense, organizational socialization also teaches the organizational culture. So looking at that typology, I'm just going to present it quickly. They proposed a theory of organizational socialization that rests on a typology of 6 socialization tactics, each producing different role orientations, degree of ambiguity, and conflict among recruits, as well as variance in job satisfaction, commitment, and occupational leaving. And that was in their study. And they did Van Manen did an ethnographic study with police officers. The 5 socialization tactics relevant to the current study that they proposed are collective versus individual, formal versus informal, sequential versus random, fixed versus variable, and serial versus disjunctive. Collective tactics, for instance, are common learning experience designed to standardize how recruits respond to situations, and thus they socialize the recruits to accept the organizational standards tied to their occupational role. On the flip side, the individual socialization tactics allow for heterogeneity in the response of recruits by providing unique learning opportunities rather than standardized. So it allows for more innovation in how recruits adapt to the occupational role. So what I saw specifically is individual, informal, variable, random, and disjunctive socialization tactics that Jones refers to as individualized socialization tactics are correlated with innovative role orientations. So people will do things with more agency and behave in different ways. Where we have institutional socialization tactics that are collective, formal, sequential, fixed, and serial will result in more situational consistency. So in the behavior of new employees. For large organizations that hire many new employees at a time, such as the Training Academy or Correctional Services Canada, training programs occur often prior to the beginning of the job. So these programs are, in essence, they're instruments of organizational socialization. And they're invested in by these organizations because training processes support employee organizational occupational adjustment, as well as their attitudes and behaviors, and can reinforce organizational commitment. So the CTP is of undeniable importance, as it's in CTP, recruits are formally trained for their occupational role, and they're informally socialized into the occupational position. So reflecting on the typology, the training environment at the academy uses formal. So recruits are separated from the employees. So those are formal tactics. Fixed, they adhere to a timetable at CTP. It's sequential, recruits are informed about the occupational role. Collective in that it's a common learning experience, and serial in that trainers are all experienced COs. So those are the socialization tactics. So the expectation is also for the trainers at the academy to perform as role models for the recruits, while the academy socializes recruits in a manner that encourages standardized responses when approaching situation and promotes organizational commitment. So we see this really strong collective orientation, but what became very clear is this individual caveat, and it kept coming up no matter how we were socialized in that context. So here I'm going to talk about this idea of integrity and the acceptation to standardized responses in the area of integrity. So this is when institutional socialization tactics, standardized responses, kind of intertwine or cause tension with individualized emphases. So at the academy, the seemingly contradictory message emerges, where the academy atmosphere and lessons encourage collective solidarity and camaraderie among the recruits. And then collective responses while also reminding the recruits to stay self-focused, enforcing that each recruit is accountable for their actions, no matter what their actions are, and their role in the actions of others. So being an accomplice doesn't go far, right? So recruits are both to be bonded and split. On the one hand, you learn to have each other's backs and protect each other, but the other, you learn never to turn a blind eye towards concerning behaviors. So in response, recruits appear to be socialized for what I refer to as this caveated kind of camaraderie, where recruits learn the value of collective solidarity and camaraderie, but only as far as all recruits act with integrity and abide to the behavioral expectations of the organization. What results is this slight lacing of mistrust among colleagues that nags at the level of solidarity among a cohort. So an environment that breeds hypervigilance and surveillance as characteristics of employees, it's not surprising that it also inadvertently socializes officers to be reserved with their trust. But it's interesting. So here's the tension. So you have this individual caveat, and then at the same time, you have a collective underpinning. So the environment of CTP is very much laden with stress, and particularly in that stress is testing. And you can basically earn over 50 recruits. Over 50. You can earn over 50 passes, I guess, or there's over 50 tests, and if you fail 3 of them, and that means getting a score that is under 70, basically at that point you would be dismissed from the academy. You could come back and start it again, but you would be released and sent home. And a lot of these tests, when we work on them, you have to do them with another individual. So they're done in partnership, like self-defense. Many of the tests are done in pairs. So what happens, ironically, in this thing is the strike system, intentionally or not, creates dependence between recruits or pairs of recruits who rely on each other to practice for testing and when performing their tests. And because some tests are performed in pairs, right? So given recruits help each other, they become more and more dependent on each other, and this trusted colleague becomes an invaluable support when testing. So, and it's really interesting in this sense, because through testing, you genuinely rely on the other recruits, but yet at the same time, you're being cautious with your trust. And another thing that was really stressful, and also is where we saw the collective solidarity, was on when people were doing remedial testing. So on, for example, firearms testing, when we saw individuals who were working together, they would really come together to kind of get through that sort of testing and work with each other and practice in that kind of context. So it was actually an interesting element. And the release process itself, again, another caveat to the camaraderie, but building it at the same time, knowing the reality of someone going home is also quite difficult in that context, and that would also unite individuals. So basically, overall, underpinning both individualized and collective training practices, as well as institutional socialization tactics, is a value placed on effective, moral, and continuous elements of organizational commitment, and it reinforces that recruits are psychologically committed, organizationally loyal, and invested in CSC. So although caveated camaraderie is taught, the pressure-infused training environment produces strong bonds between recruits in focusing on both the individual recruit and the greater collective. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That sounds like quite an experience, Rosemary. Okay, our final presenters, and thanks to the presenters so far for being on time. Our final presenters are Marcella, Siqueira, Cassiano, sorry if I butchered that, and Professor Ricciardelli. So, Marcella.
So just, I want to check in. Do you see my screen? Do you see it well? Do you hear me well?
I can see it.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so my name is Marcella, and today I'm going to be presenting to you a study on the well-being of correctional officers. This study is led by Professor Ricciardelli, and also we have several co-investigators of this study here in the audience. So I'm going to be presenting on the behalf of all the, the entire project. So I would like to start by asking you to think of a dangerous job. Usually, when we think of a dangerous job, we use the metric, or we measure in terms of fatal injury. And then construction, manufacturing, transportation, that tops the list. However, today, I would like to think of dangerous job in terms of, I would like to measure it in terms of mental health injuries. And when we do that, first responders, they come right at the top of the list. I am talking about healthcare workers, I'm talking about public safety personnel in general, police officers, paramedics, firefighters, correctional officers, the topic of my presentation, military personnel, also border security personnel. So those folks, they have to deal, they are first responders, they provide care, and so they have to deal with suicide, they have to deal with suicide attempt, they have to deal with altercations, they have to deal with stabbing and drug use and abuse and overdose on a daily basis. So they see it's all about taking care of people suffering and a lot of misery. So it's about helping, and that can be extremely stressful, particularly in the case of correctional officers now working on this project. And so far I have interviewed about 20 officers, and all we hear is them when we ask about their work and daily work, they tell us about how stressful this is, and how they have this constant anxiety, or they are in a constant state of alarmness, always waiting for something bad to happen. So we hear cases of officers that they say, we do rounds, and then I'm always especially at night, I'm always concerned to see, and then if I'm going to find someone who's not alive, or if I'm going to find someone overdosing. So it's almost like this, they are in a confined space and all in alert all the time. So it's extremely stressful. And the data, and also in the interviews, I hear a lot correctional officers telling us that after they took on that job, they became an officer, even their relationship with life outside of work changed completely. So people telling us that, when they go to restaurants, they like to sit behind, with their backs to the wall, because they're always kind of something bad's going to happen. So they're always on edge. That's an expression that they use a lot during the interviews. I'm always on edge. And people saying that when they are walking on the streets, it's almost like their relationship with the urban landscape changes, because they are continuously doing surveillance, scanning the landscape for danger and for potential risk. So anyways, it's extremely stressful, and the data shows that. So in Canada, we have about 250 public safety personnel, and about half of them, they have symptoms for a mental health disorder. So that would make 125,000 people, lots of people. And then about a third of them, they screen positive for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders, and major depression. So, the situation is extremely alarming, and not only in Canada, elsewhere as well. The trend is about the same. But here in Canada, the Standing Committee on Public Safety Canada and National Security, they issued a report in 2016 that acknowledged, that was extremely important, because it was a formal acknowledgement of the situation that public safety officers experience on the ground in terms of PTSD, and also what we call operational stress injuries, which is, it's a kind of a loose term still for occupational stressors. So for any kind of occupational stressors, it can be organizational, it can be operational. So this report called for action. So it's time for us really to act, because the situation on the ground it's extremely concerning. So among the recommendations of the report, we have a call for Canadian society, I mean, all sides of society, to work on defining the term public safety officer, define operational stress injuries, because it's still kind of a loose term. We need to understand that better and create, a kind of substantiate that and create something more stronger. Collect data to understand the realities on the ground, understand the particularities of the work environment of public safety personnel, and also develop a comprehensive research approach on prevention, education, screening, and treatment for mental health disorders. So, like as a response, in response to this report, many academics took action, including Professor Ricciardelli here, who just presented. So she initiated a project with 18 co-investigators across 15 universities in Canada, and also in the UK, in the US, France. We have, I think, 8 universities in Canada, 3 in the UK, 1 in the US, 1 in France, and we have about 20 affiliates, including undergrad students, all the way to postdoc students, like people like me. And also several partners, especially the unions, the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, the Union of Safety and Justice Employees, Memorial University, because we're all based at Memorial, and also Correctional Service Canada. So, with this project, which we have 2 objectives. So we want to understand how prison work shapes the well-being of federal correctional officers over time, and also understand if prison work is inherently associated with operational stress injuries. So to tackle those 3 questions, we have 3, or tackle those two objectives, we have 3 research questions. And so we want to understand changes over time in terms of the officer's mental health, self-reported and also clinically assessed, and also changes in the officer's health knowledge and over time, and also understand the factors shaping the correctional officer's health over time. So because we are looking at overtime trends and overtime transformations, so the project that we have, it's longitudinal, and it is a mixed method project. So we rely on a mixed method approach. So it's longitudinal, right? So we collect data at baseline data when people get enrolled in the project, and a year later, and then we keep collecting like annually. So here, in terms of baseline measures, we have 4. So we have 2 surveys, and we have 1 interview, and we have 1 clinical evaluation. And it's important to say that here, the baseline measures, they happen when the participants, they are in CTP. CTP, it means Correctional Training Program, and Professor Ricciardelli has just presented her experience there. So it happens there, and then a year later, we come back, to interview the person again, the same person again, and then at that moment, the person will be an officer. So here, the person is a recruiter, and here is going to be an officer. And then we have, again, 2 surveys. I'll say in a second why I have like different colors of green here. So we have 2 surveys, and we have 1 clinical evaluation and 1 interview. And in the surveys here, what we do is we have 2 types of survey to mimic what happened at baseline, and we alternate them with, like, if it's odd year or whichever, according to the wave that the follow-up wave that we're doing. So there's a lot of details for me to cover here. I will save it for later in case you have questions. But overall, to organize this project, because it's such a large project, we divided the data collection into committees. So we have the quantitative committee in charge of the surveys, and we have the qualitative committee in charge of the interviews, and then we have the clinical committee in charge of the clinical evaluation, because the clinical evaluation is always done by someone who is a clinical. You have to have clinical training to do it. So of course, for us to collect this kind of data, we rely on the partnership with Correctional Service Canada, and that's extremely important for us because that's where the research takes place. And until COVID, we were doing everything in person except for the surveys that they were online. And after COVID, now we moved to telephone because it's just otherwise it's impossible to do the research because of restrictions. You know, I don't have to give too much detail because everybody knows about it. But what's important, we rely on Correctional Service Canada, but participation, enrollment in our project is completely voluntary and confidential. It's not anonymous, but it is confidential. So like all the partners helping us to facilitate this research, they don't really know, they can't, the partners themselves, they cannot match, you know, they cannot identify the person and the person to the content of the interview. And here, let me just give you a little data collection, show you our status. So far, like in terms of survey, we've done 256 baseline surveys. This is as of January this year. And so it's now more than that. And follow-up 28. You're going to see that there's a discrepancy, which is not ideal in a longitudinal project, but I will address that in a second. And then interviews, we have so far 383 baselines and 105 follow-ups. Clinical assessments, we have 171 baselines and 29 follow-ups. And then the follow-ups that we have is wave 1 and 2. Here, it's important to say that this discrepancy that we have, it has to do with COVID, unfortunately. COVID is just like destroying our research life as well. So it's like here, like if you, like, this timeline is going to help me to explain what's going on. So we started this project in August 2018, and we go by fiscal year. So like that meant that, you know, our first year was pretty short. So that's when we hit the ground and doing data collection. And then we had year 2 of the project was very nice because no COVID, everything, you know, was working. And then when we start to do the follow-ups from year number 1, like in August, we start to follow up, you know, like we just had a couple months and then COVID hit us, you know, and then with the restrictions, and then we had to stop interviewing in person, and for a period of time we have to stop interview at all, and it was very complex. So we resumed this year in January to interview and over the telephone. So now we are playing catch-up game, you know, with the follow-ups, but so far we've been successful, you know, with that. And you know, so people are the interviews, the data collection, the data is flowing. And this project officially so far it's 5 years, but we already know that there is a huge possibility to renew it. So it's probably going to go all the way to 2028. And in terms of results, it's public. There's a lot going on in this project. I'm just giving you a little bit, just like I'm scratching the surface here. So in terms of publications, we have, the authors, some of the co-authors, they are in the audience. So we have one paper about the correctional officers' views of sexuality and transgender placement of inmates, of prisoners. We have another paper that just came up 3 days ago. It's about motivations, like why people choose that specific career, why people want to be correctional officers. We have another one about training and the training elements and how people react to training. We also have like other papers that they are either in submission or they are ready to go. They're going to be submitted like this week or next week. So we have one, it's the protocol paper, like our research protocol, which is a part of it I am presenting to you here. We have another paper about infectious diseases, the fear that correctional officers have of infectious diseases, and that amounts to, you know, like the stress that they experience on a daily basis. We have another one here about occupational fitness and peer expectation of fitness. And we have Ricciardelli's paper about the ethnographic experience that she had. And we also have a very strong activist side on this project. So there are like many initiatives, like, you know, publishing opinion pieces in large newspapers in Canada and abroad. And so this year we had 2 pieces about vaccination by Ricciardelli and another co-author. and with co-authors. But here I'd like to share with you what I personally think that is the most important accomplishment in this project. So because of the activism that we do and this knowledge that we are creating and all led by Professor Ricciardelli, the correctional officers in Canada, they are now covered since December last year by the Memorial Grant. And that, it means a lot. For those of you who are not familiar with this grant, I'm about to wrap up here, just like a couple more seconds. For those of you who are not familiar with that, that gives about a maximum of $300,000 for the families, the beneficiaries of those people who, of families of beneficiaries of correctional officers who died in the line of duty. So this is extremely important, and it's something very concrete for the families. And so far, even though correctional officers, they are first responders, they were not covered, and now they are. And so before I wrap up, I just would like to acknowledge, our funds from Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Correctional Service Canada, and the partnership with Correctional Service Canada, the unions, and also Memorial University. And also thank you very much for being here today and for your attention. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Marcella. That was it's a very large project. I thought you gave an excellent overview and summary. So I'm involved in the project. I learned a few things. So that's good. All right. So we have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions for our panelists, put them in the Q&A. Okay, well, I have a question for Rosemary. Rose, you talked about sort of being involved with the group and leaving the group and coming back. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the psychology of that and how that impacted, how that impacted your feelings?
I think it was really, really important to not become overly close. So it was one of the caveats that I put on myself entering is that I didn't want to interfere. And I know you can't guarantee this, but I didn't want to interfere in everyone else's experience. And I know no matter what, being there's going to be interference. But what I was really trying to do was and make sure that everyone's relationships and circles, that I wasn't key to any of them. And that was really important. And one of the ways to do that, especially at those times where we're going through a lot of stuff, people are missing our families, doing whatever, things are happening, and there's a lot going on when you're there. So if I found I was really starting to rely on a person, or that would be a time where it was really important to me to remove myself, at least temporarily. And then when you come back, the dynamics change on a daily basis. So I would come back 2 days later, and people look different. I can't explain it. It was because there's so much physical activity, so everyone was shrinking. And you come back to these differences and then just find a new place. But I think it was an important distinction to stay enough of an outsider to feel comfortable being critical, but also being part of it.
Okay, I have a question for Madu. You talk a bit about your own personal experience of why you didn't get a job, and our questioner wonders if you could speak to how this made you feel and what you think could be done to change this mentality.
It was actually very, very depressing. I had just come out of law school, and I applied to a law firm. Naturally in Nigeria, most law firms employ male lawyers. According to them, male lawyers are the ones that can withstand the whole rigorous process of the law firm. So when as a fresh lawyer, I decided to apply to apply to join the law firm. And it was really depressing hearing statements like that. Oh, since you have a boyfriend already, you're going to get married soon, and when you get married, it's just natural that you start popping babies. That was the exact statement I heard. I was like, is that the only reason why I came into this world, to pop babies? Like, that's so wrong. But at the end of the day, I did not still get the job. I just think this mentality can be found everywhere. In fact, including my own father. When I wanted to come to Canada for my master's, my father was like, I'm supposed to get married before leaving Nigeria. So it's a really, I don't even know how to explain what can be done. I had to sit down and explain, like educating my father on the fact that I could actually be whoever and whatever I wanted to be, provided I am an adult. So it took that kind of courage for him to allow me to travel to Canada for my master's. If not, I wouldn't have been able to do so. So I think education is the starting point. We need to educate the people on this, especially those people that are quite elderly. And sometimes when you try to do that, they would put you forward as someone who is rude, and especially if you're now a female lawyer, they'll be like, female lawyers don't have respect, that's why they don't get married on time. We just have that general stereotype. So it's just about educating the general populace on the importance of women reaching for the corporate ladder if and when they want to.
Yeah, I find that interesting, right? Like people talk a lot about that, about the micro, right? So that you, so being a male of a certain age, you know, I've changed my views on a variety of things over the years. And so that wasn't always, you know, great insight, or I wake up, it's usually people saying, hey, don't say that. Hey, you should look at things this way, or, right? So, yeah, so those little things, yeah, the micro being assertive in those situations, I think can make a difference. Okay. Yeah, there's a general question that's been asked for all the presenters, and what about the ethics involved in doing your research? How is it approved by your universities, and some of the barriers that you might have faced receiving this? Marcella, maybe I'll start with you.
I'll give some details here and then let Professor Ricciardelli to pick up, because she has much more context than I do. But what I can tell here is that for example, I showed you, like the measures that we have. So we have consent for all of that. Consent for the surveys are embedded. In terms of, so that is in our ethics, that's how we got to prove it. For the interviews, we usually do the interviews, we do them in a combo with clinical. So like the interviewer comes, does the interview, and then, like someone else steps in, a clinical person steps in and does the clinical component. So we do a shared consent. That's how we approved. So it's pretty straightforward in the sense that, I mean, it's what we would do in any other kind of research. And in terms of like how the ethics, how that played, I believe that approving wasn't too much of our deal, but I'll let Professor Rosemary, discuss more of that.
The ethics are an ongoing reality. We update with every change, so there's more amendments to this file than anyone can imagine. And also we update with adverse events that happens within the sample. So with every adverse event, we try to do more to avoid such adverse events in the future. So it's less about ethics, I guess, at that point, but just trying to do your best you can by the participants, right?
Did you receive any resistance from your ethics boards, or?
We got a lot of constructive criticism and a lot of what didn't feel like support at times, but they were just working with us to move the ethics process forward. So like every ethics process, sometimes it can be a bit frustrating, but at the same time, everyone is really well-intentioned and it's made the project stronger.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure our students didn't think it was that easy to get such an intrusive type of project.
No, it's terribly hard.
Okay, Madu?
Actually, my own research does not require ethics approval. I actually wanted to do qualitative research before, but there were several limitations, especially with this COVID. And since my program was just a year, I was advised not to if I'm to complete the program for 1 year. So I just decided to concentrate more on the doctrinal research methodology and the comparative method.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, really good answers. I have another question for Marcella. Person wondered if you had the demographics for men and women participating in the study, maybe a bit of a breakdown.
Yes, I can do that right now. So like it's about 60% of the officers that we have in our sample, they are males, and 40% females. They are about 60% of them, they are married, and the remaining, the second largest group remaining is single, people who have never married. And then we also have people in common law, but mostly married people. So they are kind of good share of gender, and then mostly married. And then in terms of the age, they are it's most of them, they are, I would say that 70% of them, they are under 40 years of age. So that's what they are here. And I think that's those are the main demographics that we collect.
Is there any sort of a bias with respect to the proportion of females? Because certainly we don't see 40% of correctional officers in federal penitentiaries being female.
No, actually, well, Professor Ricciardelli can add, but like, I don't know, I can't see who asked that question, but like for you who asked this question, we interview like virtually everybody who enters training to become a correctional officer. So there's not really a bias there, because virtually we get 99.9% of participation in the project. So people are willing to participate. So it's just the actual reality. But Professor Ricciardelli, if you want to jump in.
No, I was saying I think CSC can be credited for the amount they do in terms of gender diversity and other types of diversity and inclusion in their recruitment and their training. It's quite a diverse group. That doesn't institutions, because these efforts are all relatively recent, right? So it'll take time to have a full trickling through effect.
And as me, just when I had something like me coming to work with Professor Ricciardelli, and I had a lot of like stereotypes in my mind about correctional officers. And it's funny because like now that I interview, I see that I expected something to be like very patriarchal, and it's not at all like the way I thought. It's I'm being in that in gender area, I'm being positively surprised. But in terms of the stress that they face, I am. It's worse than what I could ever imagine, but like in terms of the gender balance, it's there. You can see it.
Yeah, well, there's been a significant shift in the provincial. Here in Manitoba, if you go to Headingley, maybe about 50% often a female correctional officer on shift. So nice to see federally, Correctional Service of Canada, that there's some catch up in that area. Okay.
There's a question here about recommendations. I will transfer this question to Rose, to Professor Ricciardelli as well, because she has a bigger picture of the project, so she's in a better position to talk about it. Thank you for your question, Maureen.
And just to speak to that, the recommendations that come out of this work are multifold. And so the ethnographic work, I'll speak to that. The top 3 recommendations was a need for cultural competency training, and as well as a lot more awareness of the experience of Indigenous and Black prisoners. Both of those have been in the process of being rectified and are starting to move forward. The other thing that one of the recommendations was trauma-informed training, and that as well as and moves for recruitment. We have recommendations for organizational commitment. We have recommendations tied to transgender placement prisoner policies and the policies that surround those for staff. And we make recommendations in terms of mental health and well-being as well.
And infectious diseases as well.
And COVID.
Yeah, it is a super giant project.
Great team. Yeah.
And we have a lot of co-investigators here, so like.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to get to all of the questions because I'm mindful of the time, because it's lunchtime, and I know people might want to grab a quick bite before our featured speaker, which will be at 12:30. So I'm going to thank all our panelists again, and thank everyone for attending, and look forward to perhaps chatting with you over the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.